I spent a big chunk of this morning watching Hurricane Dorian. In fact, I've been watching Hurricane Dorian for the better part of 3 or 4 days now, and as many of us will be aware, the effect on the Bahamas has been absolutely devastating. I don't think it's actually received the media coverage that it should have. Things would have been very, very different, I promise, if Dorian had made landfall over Miami or New Orleans or Houston or something like that. Besides human interest as a member of the human race, the other main interest is I'm also responsible for our Nat Cat and reinsurance strategies at the New Zealand Superfund. We took massive losses on those strategies in 2017 from Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, from the wildfires, the Camp and the Tubbs and the Paradise wildfires. The story repeated itself in 2018. 2019, Dorian came awfully close to making life rather hard for me over the weekend. But there is something that's happening here. I've spent, with several other members of our team, months now researching, trying to understand what climate change is doing to hurricane activity. Is it actually making them more frequent? Is it making them more intense? Is it causing them to intensify more rapidly? Is it causing them to change their tracks? Will where they make landfall change? Will they dissipate when they do make landfall? How long are they going to hang around? Are they going to carry more water? These things, the only thing that I've actually learned with certainty is we do not understand these things very well at all. And I think that has big implications for us. It means, can we still afford to, can insurers be counted on to actually still be there and provide insurance services for our houses? I do not believe that the answer there is clear. More generally, we have fundamental stock analysts in our team. They're kind of like trying to see whether they should buy an airline stock. They're trying to imagine, well, what if this flight shaming thing actually takes hold? Our rural team that goes around buying beef farms, what if we also start reducing meat consumption? The point that I'm trying to make is that there is no getting away from incorporating climate change analysis into your investment decision making. So, what are people doing about it? How are we going to do it? How scared should we be? I have 3 wonderful people here to help answer some of those questions. I have, to my immediate right, Erwin Jackson. Erwin's Director for Policy at the Investor Group on Climate Change. He's previously spent time in academia and was Deputy CEO of the Climate Institute. Joanna Chang, Investment Risk Specialist at APRA, and a founding member of APRA's Climate Change Working Group. And then lastly, at the end of the table, Sam Sicilia, CIO of Hostplus. Sam's very experienced, spent a lot of time, and I promise will at least scare some of us quite a lot. Anyway, with that, let me kick things off. Erwin.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to come along today. I've been asked to do a few things in terms of my introductory remarks. One, just give a bit more background on myself, the context in which I come at this issue from, and then to share some sort of personal views that are informed by the previous 2 subjects at the end. So just off quickly on me, and I won't take very long on this because as Sam has already been covered to an extent, but I've been working on climate change for about 30 years now, as you can probably tell from the look of me. That's principally been in climate change policy in Australia, but also I've done quite a lot of work internationally within UN processes, both the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And one of the core messages that emerged during that period and became really clear when I was at the Paris conference in 2015 was that the role of investors in this conversation was becoming very, very important. And I think when I reflect on the Paris meeting, if I think of the 2 things that really struck me from that meeting, one was for the first time we saw in that process sort of a coalition of the willing of countries across a broad cross-section of the countries involved in the process coming together to agree a deal which I would have, at the time, most of us thought wouldn't have been possible. I think expectations for Paris were less than what we actually got. And the second was the overwhelming feeling that the investment community was starting to take this issue seriously. And in November last year, I got approached by IGCC to join the team to help them out with their policy and advocacy work, and I jumped at the opportunity. So for those who don't know IGCC, and I'm assuming we've got quite a few of our members in the room, and if you're not a member, I've got some membership application forms in my bag. What IGCC is, we're an industry association. We represent we have just over 70 members with about 2 trillion in assets under management across Australia and New Zealand. And we focus on, we've just published our new strategic plan for the next 3 years, and we focus on sort of 5 main areas. One is around policy and advocacy, and this is what I'm ultimately responsible for. And we have an ambition to be one of Australia's, if not Australia's, leading voice from the investment side on climate change policy issues, because I think, and I'll talk about this a bit later on, but one of the things that has become really clear to me over the last 6 months is there is a massive appetite amongst policymakers, the media, and broader society to actually hear what investors are saying, doing and thinking about as it comes to climate change, and many opportunities for government in particular to learn from what investors are already doing on climate change to inform their own policy making. The other area is around catalysing net zero emissions investment, and a related area which is building resilient climate change portfolios. And the role that IGCC plays there is we really bring together and facilitate discussions amongst our members around some of the challenges, the opportunities that they're confronting, and how we can address those going forward. The other area which I think is also becoming increasingly interesting and important is how can investors influence the real economy? And this is an area which we play a role in facilitating the Australian end of the Climate Action 100, which I'm assuming a few of you are familiar with, but if you're not, it's a global initiative which has about 330 investors, about 35 trillion in assets under management, which coordinate engagement across the top 160 systemic emitters on climate change. And that, with recent decisions by Glencore, BHP, Rio and others, has become very prominent in the media, but I also think it's a critical role and a very important initiative that investors can play in terms of engaging with companies to influence the decisions they're making and therefore the real economy. And the last area, which I'm not going to touch on a lot, but we also host the Asia Investor Group on climate change, which is really focused on mobilising investors throughout the Asia region. We also do quite a lot of collaboration with our international peers in Europe and North America, and Climate Action 100 is an example of that. The thing I probably wanted to focus on next was really, in my observations over the last 9 months in coming into this role, I'd probably say a few things. One of the things that's really struck me, and there are many issues that could be talked about, but one of the things that really stood out for me is the challenge that investors have in assessing the real risk of climate change. Very sophisticated tools are emerging in terms of how investors can think about the physical impacts of climate change, but they have, by their very nature, they're very limited. And just to give you an example of that, one of our members, Energetics, did a lot of work with the CommBank recently looking at the risks of climate change to their agribusiness book. And that basically found that across dairy, beef and grains, that over the next 30, 40 years, they saw between 40 and 60% reduction in production across all of those commodities in response to climate change. Really interesting piece of analysis. It's probably the first time I've seen a bank do that kind of in-depth, sort of very granular level of analysis on those kinds of risks. But the reason I say there is a challenge still is that is still a very narrow focus. It doesn't consider, for example, how climate change would impact the export markets for those commodities. And we've seen some recent work which suggests that in some of the key export markets for this region, for our country, for example, in New Zealand, that you get between 50 and 100% reductions in GDP under a 4-degree world. And that's only considering a very limited range of climate change impacts. So the question is, in my mind, and the challenge is how do investors begin to factor those kinds of impacts, and how do we have a real hard look at what climate change really means across the economy and for the particular investments that we made. The other thing I wanted to raise was also that I also think there's a significant opportunity. As I mentioned earlier, I've been engaging public policy in this area for a very long time, but over the last few months when I've been engaging with the regulators, with government officials both at a Commonwealth and a state level, there is a real appetite to understand what investors are doing, to learn from what investors are doing, how they're thinking about and managing transition risk, what tools are they using, how are they factoring in climate change into investment decisions, into infrastructure, for example, and what can policymakers learn from that in developing their own policy. And just to give one example of that, the Australian Energy Market Regulator is running a program at the moment to assess the impacts of climate change on the electricity sector, and that will then influence the decisions they make on transmission and distribution planning, which of course is of interest to our members. And one of the things that they've been very interested in and engaged with us on is how do investors think about this issue? How are they starting to think about how you create a value for investment and adaptation, which then that will be used in terms of the policy frameworks and the engagement they do with governments in developing more resilient infrastructure in the electricity system over the next few years. I also think the other opportunity is in more direct public policy engagement in the public sphere. Like, one of the things that I find quite often is that policymakers and the media aren't necessarily aware or understand what investors are doing on climate change. We've been hosting some media roundtables with senior media people over the last couple of weeks, and that's been the real value that those media people have come out of it. They didn't quite understand that the actions that investors were taking and what that actually meant for the beneficiaries that investors have, but also for the economy overall. And the last thing I wanted to say was, and I'm aware of what Sam's going to say, so I'm going to put this one in here to lift you up a bit before Sam comes on, is that I've been working on this issue for 30 years, and if someone had said to me 10 years ago that renewable energy was the cheapest cost of new generation in most countries around the world, and that we have probably, if not pretty close to, reached peak thermal coal, I would have laughed at them. So the world has actually moved very rapidly without actually trying very hard. And I think if we actually start to get our act together, both as investors, the community, government, we can actually make a real dent in this problem. Thanks.
All right, I seem to have neglected one of my important duties as moderator, which is to tell you that the app is live and available for your questions. Please do send them through. I know that there'll be lots on this. Please also select the right room. In case you haven't worked out, we're in the ballroom, so that'll make sure that the questions show up right here. Okay. Thanks very much, Erwin. Joanna, could I invite you?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the AIST for another great conference this year. Okay, just some opening remarks from me. So APRA's role in climate change risk. So APRA's mandate is centred around financial stability, so ensuring that our regulated entities remain strong, stable, and able to meet promises to its beneficiaries. And so an increasingly central part of that goal is climate change risk management. And so encouragingly, we've also seen the RBA and ASIC make similar public statements around the importance of climate change risk management. So why is APRA getting involved in this issue? Our view is that it's time for the climate change risk debate to move beyond a moral argument, and we see that the threats from climate change risk being distinctly financial in nature. And then we're of the view that entities that do not take action on climate change risk are likely to be left behind. I mean, we see overseas examples of companies collapsing due to their inability to manage the physical, transitional and liability risks associated with climate change risk management. But then conversely, our view is that entities that be on the front foot with managing their climate change risk exposures are going to be at a competitive advantage to their peers. And so rather than seeing economic factors as barriers to taking action on climate change risk, they recognise it's these economic factors that are making these actions imperative. So, bit of a spoiler alert, the regulators haven't found the answer to solving the climate change risk problem. It's a very big macro issue with unknown pathways and unknown outcomes, as the panel will discuss. So, whilst regulators and industry are collectively working towards bridging that knowledge gap in this area, so what are we advocating that entities do? So our current recommended approach is that entities manage climate change risks within their existing risk management frameworks, alongside the other risks that are impacting your businesses. So in the APRA context, that's through the lens of CPS 220, our risk management standard. And so what CPS 220 requires is for the board to have in place a risk management framework that's suited to the nature, the scale and the complexity of the entity's operations. So the implications of that is that senior management and board will need to implement processes that both limit the exposures arising from climate risk and also to capitalise on opportunities that climate change brings. So stepping back a bit, I suppose a bit of a recap of what we actually mean by climate change related financial risks. So firstly, physical risks being characterised by extreme weather events, extreme temperatures, and the financial implications of physical risks would be things like impact on asset values, increase in insurance claims, and increase in loan defaults. Transitional risks being characterised by social adaptation, technological innovation rather, and policy changes. And the financial impacts here would include stranded assets, changes in pricing and demand, and supply chain disruption. And we also have liability risks characterised by litigation and regulatory enforcement, with the financial impacts here that could include litigation payouts or regulatory penalties. I won't be stepping through each of these events listed on this timeline. I mean, it's really designed to illustrate just the pickup in activity on the part of regulators and the industry over the past couple of years as we collectively move from an awareness-raising phase to a more active stance on climate change risk. Just a few key things I will call out. So I suppose what the external events that really played a big part in APRA getting involved in this issue back in 2016 included the Paris Climate Agreement, the TCFD recommendations, and the Australian legal opinion on directors' duties with respect to climate change risk, or the Hutley opinion. So in 2017 we started our awareness raising efforts. That's when our climate change working group was formed internally, and also the working group amongst the Council of Financial Regulators, or COFA. And so last year, we really saw quite a pickup in industry initiatives around addressing climate change risk, a lot of work being done internationally within the regulatory community. And late last year, we ran our climate change risk survey, which I'll run through very quickly on the following slides. And so this year in March, we released an information paper which summarised findings of our climate risk survey and also provide a bit of a stock take around actions that APRA has been taking in this space. Okay, so very quickly on the climate risk survey, why did we run it? Firstly, to take a bit of a baseline read on what climate change risk practices were actually being undertaken across our regulated population, so all of our regulated industries, and to identify best practices that are out there, and also to help inform our supervisory approach going forward. So there were 38 entities, and we got to the 38, like we were aiming for a coverage around 80% of regulated assets. And so for a voluntary survey, we got 100% response rate. So thank you to all the super funds there that are involved in this survey exercise with us. The questions reflected the key elements of the TCFD framework. So very key high-level findings. There was a general awareness of climate change risk issues, particularly among the super funds, which was great. And the more mature responses embedded climate change risk practices within existing risk management frameworks, which is very encouraging. There is some scenario analysis being undertaken, but we'll talk about the limitations that were being reported there. There's some TCFD type disclosures which are beginning to be reported, but I think it's fair to say that across all the industries there's still a way to go on that one. But I think most encouragingly of all that not only did the survey respondents talk about risks, but they also called out opportunities that they identified from climate change risk. So next steps for APRA. So continuing our regulatory engagement, engagement with the industry. So, a strong supporter of industry initiatives like the Sustainable Finance Roadmap. We're involved as observers in a number of the working groups there. Continuing our local and global regulatory leadership with our COFA partners, as well as international bodies like the IAIS and the Sustainable Insurance Forum. Building our capabilities internally with our supervision team, so providing them resources so they can better able to conduct targeted supervisory assessments of climate change risk arrangements within their entities, and all building towards a more targeted supervisory response. Just leave you, I guess, with some questions for your boards and for your senior management to consider. So firstly, is the board aware of, potential climate risk impacts and issues for your entities? What sort of metrics and targets would you consider implementing with regards to climate change risk? How would climate change risk be identified, assessed and measured? And with regards to strategy, to what extent has climate change risk impacts been considered in the context of impacts on the financial position, the reputation and the operations of your fund? So I'll leave you with the words of Dr. Seuss. So unless someone like you cares an awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. And I think that's a nice lead into our next panellist, who's very passionate about this topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. All right, just a reminder, please keep those questions coming. There's already some very good ones. In fact, I might take a quick pause and pick up on the one that seems to have got the most votes so far. All three of you, 15 seconds or less, do you support nuclear energy? And please speak for yourselves, not for your institutions. Do you support nuclear energy?
I'll answer.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll give a personal view. I would actually like to make money, so no.
Right. Joanna, do you want to take that one?
I think given the this macro, huge, unknown nature of this issue, I think collectively, when we're talking about scenario construction, then perhaps we have to examine all possible outcomes to what is a very large and difficult problem for us to collectively consider.
So no. Sam, Cecilia, do you support nuclear energy?
Well, Yes, the risks are much less relative to the risks of burning fossil fuels.
Well done. Thank you. All right. Could I invite you now to spend 10 minutes rather than 15 seconds telling us about your views on climate change?
Okay, thank you. Let me launch straight into it. Climate change risk is much worse than we all think. Responding to climate change is the most difficult issue facing humanity. Dealing with change is always hard, but nothing compares to the difficulty with dealing with climate change. That the Earth's climate is changing is a fact. It's undisputed. It's settled science. What is disputed is whether climate change is natural or it's caused by humans. And so there's dispute about how much time we might have available before we need to be concerned. You should think about climate change as the everyday reality that you're living through right now, rather than thinking about it as some kind of looming threat that exists only in the future. But you're mistaken if you think about climate change as a problem that can be solved. Calling it a problem falsely implies that you can take action on climate change as a whole. There'll never be a time in the future where we can say that we've successfully solved the problem of climate change. Climate change is a very serious threat. Climate scientists are saying that it's urgent to do something to counter the threat. Reports released this year imply that climate change could bring about the end of civilization within 30 years if immediate and drastic changes are not made to our current course. That means you and everyone you know will probably be dead within 30 years. That conclusion is a lot worse than the most recent October 2018 report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but it was discovered from leaked drafts of climate change reports from that October 2018 report that some critical language in that report had been watered down. And the net effect of that is that climate change scientists had emerged voicing their displeasure at being forced to be overly conservative in the report scenarios. Have a think about the implications if climate scientists' results are politically watered down, and then have a think again about the possibility of the end of civilization within 30 years. 97% of scientists agree that human activity is primarily responsible for climate change. This group argues that rising levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are a direct result of human activity such as burning fossil fuels, and that those increases are causing significant and increasingly severe climate change, such as global warming, rising sea levels, loss of sea ice, stronger storms and more severe droughts. There's another group of scientists, about 1,000 of them, the other 3% if you like, who disagree that human activity is primarily responsible for climate change. That group says that human-generated greenhouse gas emissions are too small to cause climate change and that the Earth is capable of absorbing those increases anyway. They say global warming over the 20th century arises from natural processes such as fluctuations in the sun heat and ocean currents. They say that the theory of human-caused climate change is based on questionable measurements, faulty climate models and misleading science. What does the public think? Ordinary people, of course, are not climate scientists. We live in a world of diverse views with diverse political systems and, of course, vested interests. So it shouldn't come as a big surprise then that despite the scientific evidence, different groups in our society have different views about climate change. There are typically three groups of people in society. One group is called the concerned believers. These are people that are highly worried about global warming. They think it's a serious threat in their lifetime. They believe it's a result of human activity, and they think reports about it are accurate or underestimated. There's another group of people in our society called the cool skeptics. This group has the exact opposite views to the concerned believers. They worry little or not at all about global warming. They don't think it's going to pose a serious threat in their lifetime, and they think global warming is attributable to environmental changes, and they think the news exaggerates the issues. And there's often a group in the middle, the mixed middle. They have some kind of combination of views. They think global warming is caused by humans, but they don't really care much, or they say it's a natural phenomena and they're highly worried about it. But science is not the same as opinion. They're not the same thing. How is it that we've managed to replace science with belief? In any case, does it really matter what the primary cause of climate change is? Do we really care if human activity is primarily responsible for climate change? The question is, can we afford to wait to find out which group of scientists is right? And do we really care what the general public believes? So what should we do? Well, let's start by leaving the climate science to the climate scientists. We should be more concerned about what actions we need to take. As it happens, if you think about all the possible consequences of climate change, they are beyond imagination. So what we really need to do is to know more about what the immediate impact of climate change will be, not just because it'll affect every one of us, but because it's going to happen a lot sooner than we all expect and think. But one thing's for sure, unless we do something about it pretty soon, at the current rates of global warming, it's inevitable that climate change will lead to the end of human life on Earth unless we do something drastic. And if that outcome is even a possibility, then surely we need a wartime response. The question is, why don't we see a wartime response right now? Is it to keep people employed today? Well, there's not going to be too many jobs on a dead planet. Is it the unbearable economic cost? Come and tell me about your investment project that's got a higher return. Surely there are much more important and much more urgent questions that we should be asking. What are the consequences of climate change on Earth? How do we respond to the impact of climate change, and what are the best and worst case scenarios, and how do we prepare for them? Climate change is not unique to our time, but humans are accelerating it. Sure, there is a natural component to climate change. So not only do we need to worry about the fossil fuels that we're burning and worrying about stopping adding greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, but we also need to worry about how do we control the natural environment that's adding to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That is volcanic activity, solar events, ocean currents, etc. Those natural forces cannot be ignored, and we also need to address them. Here's the punchline. Many scientists and advisors to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have reached the conclusion that we have now gone past the point where carbon emissions reductions alone can avoid climate change disaster. They argue that it's now necessary to take carbon emissions out of the atmosphere. But technology to extract and store carbon emissions out of the atmosphere at scale does not exist today. So we need to invent carbon capture technologies at global scale as a matter of urgency. People often ask, what is a Superfund like Hostplus doing about this? I wanted to touch on two things. Every now and again, we're approached by special interest groups requesting us to dispose of investments in, say, a coal mining company. It's not hard to guess their logic. Coal is a fossil fuel. Fossil fuels are bad. We shouldn't invest in them. Unfortunately, divestment achieves nothing. It only transfers ownership of coal shares from one investor to another. The only way to dispose of a bad asset is to sell it, and the only way to sell it is to find another buyer. Yes, divestment makes us feel good. You know, we can disclose on our website that we don't hold those assets. But tell me, how does the transfer of coal shares from you to somebody else affect the coal company? It's better to engage with the coal company. Asset owners have a right to engage, and collective engagement alongside like-minded shareholders is a very powerful thing. You must be an asset owner in order to have a voice at the table. I wanted to just mention a few things about some proactive investments that we have going at the moment. Apart from investments in energy efficient buildings, we have investments, for example, in QIC's Powering Australia Renewables Fund, the development of 1,000 megawatts of large-scale renewable energy by 2020 in Australia's national electricity market. And you all know about, I'm sure, IFM investors aim to target carbon emissions reductions by up to 100% by 2030 across its infrastructure asset holdings. There is one investment that I wanted to focus on that Hostplus has recently made because its purpose is to replace fossil fuels as the world's main energy source.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt just very quickly. We're running short of time. Please do feel free to finish up that point. But the questions are coming thick and fast, so thank you. This should be an interesting conversation.
All right, so I'll just finish that. That is my final point anyway, so thank you. The purpose of fusion energy is to replace fossil fuels. It promises limitless dispatchable energy that feeds into existing grid systems, no greenhouse gas emissions, no radiations, no proliferation risks, and we believe that we can get net fusion by 2025 and to produce fusion power on the grid by 2033. So we need to invest much more in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Just another reminder, please don't forget to rate the performance of your entertainers on the ASI app. We will start with a few questions. There's lots coming through on my screen right here, but we're also happy to do this the old school way. So feel free to raise your hands and someone will pick you out in the crowd. But maybe first things first. Joanna, perhaps I could start with you. How does APRA sort of like view climate risks relative to the other risks that trustees face?
Sure, thank you. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the approach that we advocate is that climate change risk not be managed as a standalone risk, separate from the other suite of risks, other suite of many risks which are impacting your businesses, so rather to take an integrated approach within your existing risk management frameworks.
Thanks, Joanna. There's a question coming in from the audience. Erwin, Sam, indifferent whether who wants to take this, but what's the most effective thing we can do as individuals to raise knowledge about, to raise the public's knowledge about climate change?
Well,
No, go ahead.
yeah. Well, it's not an easy question to answer in some respects because while there's lots of work being done on community attitudes to climate change, people's psychological responses to the knowledge that they have varies quite strongly amongst communities. So a common theme, for example, that you see in farming communities when you talk about climate change is that they move to denying that it's an issue because them psychologically then thinking that it the reality of it would mean that their basically farm would not have a future and all the things that they work for. So it's really hard sometimes to find ways to communicate and engage with communities on this issue. One of the things that we're certainly thinking about and working up at the moment is basically a 3 years communications campaign, which is focused on doing a couple of things. One is to better inform us about how investors are perceived and are they a credible voice when talking about climate change. The research that I've seen already suggests that they are. But I think the other thing that we're very interested in exploring is, what role can we play in helping our members communicate most effectively to their members with the risks of climate change and what they mean and the opportunities that they can take. So, from my point of view, that's sort of the one, when I was talking earlier about opportunities, to me that's one of the opportunities that the investor community has. It has, our members have 7.5 million members across Australia and New Zealand. That's a real opportunity to engage directly with the community, to talk about what investors are already doing, but also to increase their understanding of the risks and opportunities that come with taking action.
Thanks, Erwin. Sam, 6 people have taken issue with something that you said, or maybe one person's taken the same issue 6 times. Divestment achieves nothing, you said. The counterclaim is, does it not ultimately increase the cost of capital for the company?
No, because cash flow positive companies like coal companies, tobacco companies, etc., the first and last time that they went to the capital markets is when they IPO'd back in 1810. Right? So the reality is they don't need the capital markets. Okay? So look what happens when you divest. Okay? An activist comes to me, says, you're doing something bad, get rid of the tobacco shares, get rid of the coal shares. I need to find a buyer, right? That's the only way I can get rid of them. Do you agree? Right? I find a buyer, either the buyer is naive about the activist, or the buyer knows about the activist and doesn't care about the activist. So all divestment does is concentrate the shares in the hands of people that are immune from activism. It does nothing to most companies. Nothing.
Thanks, Sam. Joanna, another one for you. What kinds of information can directors and boards ask for to assess whether funds are managing climate change risk adequately?
Sure, thank you. Okay, and I guess I'll give an endorsement for the immediately preceding session on operational due diligence, and so those things like testing out, the fund manager's assertions around the processes and controls of the implementation of their stated climate change risk ethos and policies, which we would expect to form part of that due diligence process. And then I think it's really, if we take it back to that broader investment due diligence piece, I mean, a lot of that is around the validation and the verification of the stated processes, by way of verifying policies and processes and controls, and the associated reporting.
Thanks, Joanna. The same question's probably been phrased about 4 different ways. So let me sort of combine all of that and simplify it. How can investors mitigate transition risk? Does anyone want to take a stab at that one?
I suppose I'll kick off just with an observation that there is no costless transition path, and I guess to reiterate the RBA's messaging around this is that an orderly transition is preferable to an abrupt and disorderly one, which is why regulators and industry are engaging with stakeholders to try and avoid this or minimise this disorderly transition.
Erwin, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's probably say a couple of things. One is I'm not going to, there's a whole gamut of things obviously people can do, but I'd probably focus on a couple of things. I think for all its limitations, scenario analysis is still useful. And I think that the way I actually like the way that the Bank of England framed its scenarios around looking at the first stress test it's doing for the insurers, which is, think of a scenario where you've got an orderly transition to less than 1.5 degrees, one where you've got a really disruptive transition to less than 2, and then a 4-degree world, which looks pretty grim. So that's one thing. I think the other thing that I think one of the things that we found, for example, when we did our recent survey of our members, and one issue that came up with that is the impact of regulatory uncertainty, which is obviously something that impacts a lot of people, is that the most common response to that was actually that investors were engaging more with the companies that they own as a way to manage the risk. So that making sure that the companies that they own are fully managing climate risks through putting in place policies that reduce emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. They're actively engaging positively with their industry associations, etc.
The word transition implies a smooth path, right? And I take what Joanna says, and that's completely correct. But think about what happens along the way, right? As we move towards a 4-degree world and you're going through a 1 degree increase and a 2 degree increase, and sea ice starts to melt, and 600 million people that are living within 10 metres of sea level start heading towards other countries, you end up with civil wars. You're not going to be able to manage your Superfund or worry about any of these other. You're not going to have a transition at 2 or 3 degrees because you're going to have other issues to deal with along the way, right? It's not as if you can go from 1 degree to 2 to 3, all else being equal. There are consequences of 1 degree going to 2. That's going to stop you worrying about 3 degrees when you deal with those things along the way. We're saying, but by ignoring the 30-year possibility, we're saying that we don't believe climate science. That's what we're really saying.
Can I add to that one?
Actually, Erwin, there's a few more questions that are coming up, so perhaps we can take one there. Yeah.
Colin Long from Vic Super. Sam, I get what you're saying about divestment, but given that fossil fuel companies that want to expand investment in fossil fuels now are essentially engaged in a murder-suicide pact, and they are psychopaths, really, and it's good that one of the Koch brothers died recently. It's good if we get rid of the next one. What does engagement actually mean with people like that? You're actually engaging with them to say, well, your company has to shut down and we lose our money. That's effectively what we have to say. So how does engagement, what does it really mean in that context?
Okay, so let's take that for example. So first of all, if you want to do something really proactive, you could ask for something to be banned. If it's such a serious issue, get yourself elected, not you personally, but collectively as a public, vote in a particular... We live in a democracy. Look what happened at the last election. Get the laws changed and get the products banned. There's a start. That's a fast way to transition, right? The second way you do it is you get together with a group of like-minded shareholders and you bring the share registry to the board of the company and you say, hey, we represent enough votes to roll the entire board. And now that we've got your attention, right, we don't want to get rid of this board. You're all here for life. That keeps them happy, right? Okay. And now what we're going to say is the following. We understand you're a coal company or a tobacco company and that's your only product, for example, and that you're not going to agree to stop manufacturing that good because that's your only product and it's not illegal. So what we would like you to do is to divert 5% of your profits every year for the next 20 years, 5 times 20 being 100, to move from a coal company to a Coca-Cola company. Rotate slowly. If that's not fast enough for you, then either you're detrimentally hurting your investment or you may as well go for the shutdown scenario that I gave you earlier. I can't see any other way. By the way, I need to make this other point. Shutting down one mine in one country makes no difference, right? Because the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the same everywhere. So when a country burns fossil fuel on the other side of the planet, you die here.
On that note, I think we have time for one final question.
And it's Brendan Casey from REST. The obvious question, I think, for climate change in a conference like this, where we're all superfunds, hey Sam, is the sole purpose test. As we all know, members' best interests, and the courts have interpreted that as members' best financial interests. I know one of your slides, Sam, was suggesting there's no point delivering terrific retirement outcomes for someone who's dead, because they don't really make the most of it. But I'm pretty sure the regulator wouldn't accept that we could invest 100% of our funds in some sort of technology to extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere so we can try and keep our members alive in 30 years. I think in the current environment, we have to focus on that sole purpose test and delivering the financial best interests. So I'm interested in the panel's perspective on how we walk that, tightrope.
All right, we are out of time, so could I invite whoever wants to pick this one up, 30 seconds, please.
Okay,
Joanna, looks
I'll
like you
jump in.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess in 30 seconds, the sense I got from the conversations, across the past couple of days is that, ESG investing isn't being done at the expense of member financial returns. It is all the initiatives being undertaken by the trustees that I've come across are doing it, certainly with the sole purpose test firmly front of mind. I guess from APRA's point of view, because we view climate change risks as financial in nature, to the extent that we would then expect trustees to apply that investment due diligence lens over ESG investment opportunities as for any other investment opportunities that are presented to them for consideration. But we can take that offline.
Thanks, Joanna. And I think we're going to wrap things up here. As we know, it's always the last thing that we hear that's what we remember, and this is essentially the last word of the last event of the conference. So with that, I would like to give each of the three panelists just an opportunity to have one final remark. Sam, if we can start with you, what's the one key takeaway that you want everyone to walk away with?
Okay, I would argue that as an industry we must do more as a matter of urgency in this space. Yes, it might require a change of the law. It's not going to be easy, but we've not shied away from big issues in the past, and surely nothing can be more important than this one.
I've been really encouraged by just the level and the intensity of industry and engagement and interest in this topic that I've seen over the past couple of days. So keep it up and look forward to engaging with industry on this topic on an ongoing basis.
I'll just reiterate what Sam said, but add a different spin on it, which is that also make your voices heard, because at the moment they're not being.
And I will end with an apology. I have not been able to make everyone's voice heard. I know that there's lots of questions that are just sitting here on the screen, so I apologize. But please do join me in thanking the three panelists.